Miss Marple was always one step ahead. She noticed what others dismissed, read between the lines of polite conversation, and saw the cracks in the perfect facades of the English countryside. But this time, the clues weren't left by a careless murderer. They weren't hidden in the folds of a crime of passion or the whispered secrets of a guilty conscience. No, this time, the clues led somewhere else. To a place no one could explain, to events no one could understand, to a truth so deeply buried that even Agatha Christie herself seemed to erase it. In the later years of her life, Agatha Christie grew quiet about her most famous detective. While Hercule Poirot's name remained a constant in literary discussions, Miss Marple faded. Why? Why would the creator of one of the most beloved crime solvers in history hesitate to speak of her? Why would she stop writing about her? And why, when asked in interviews, did she change the subject so quickly? It is said that every detective meets a case they cannot solve. But what if Miss Marple's final case was never meant to be solved? What if she wasn't solving a crime at all, but was instead uncovering something that was never supposed to be found? There are stories, rare, obscure accounts, of a manuscript that never reached the public. A case involving Miss Marple, one that Agatha Christie either abandoned or chose to keep hidden. The manuscript was said to contain details unlike any other case in her body of work. It was darker, more unsettling, and, according to those who claimed to have seen it, it did not read like fiction. This was not a story of deduction. It was not a clever whodunit. It was something else entirely, something inexplicable, something that did not belong in the world of Miss Marple, and yet, somehow, it found her. And the most chilling part, the final line of the manuscript, the one that, if the whispers are true, was not written by Agatha Christie at all. She saw it. She knew. In the heart of London, nestled between towering buildings that seemed to fold in on themselves, there was a bookstore, a place so unassuming, so quiet, that few ever noticed it. The windows, clouded with dust, bore the faint outline of a name that had long since faded. The kind of place where time stood still, where forgotten stories lay buried beneath layers of neglect. It was here that a collector, a man obsessed with rare books and the stories that history had chosen to erase, found himself one evening. The door, heavier than it should have been, creaked on its hinges as he stepped inside. The air carried the scent of aged paper, ink, and something else, something he could not quite place. The shopkeeper, an old man with tired eyes, barely acknowledged him. This was not a place for casual browsing. It was a place for those who knew what they were looking for, even if they didn't know it yet. The collector traced his fingers over the spines of books that had been untouched for years, and then he saw it. A single manuscript, wedged between two crumbling volumes. No title on the spine, no markings to indicate what it was. Just a leather cover, worn and cracked, with a single name embossed in gold lettering. Miss Marple. The collector pulled it from the shelf, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink slightly faded, and yet the words, they were clear. Too clear, as if they had been written yesterday. The title on the first page read, Miss Marple's Last Case. He was no stranger to lost literature, to stories that had never seen the light of day. But there was something about this one, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Because this wasn't just another unpublished manuscript. This wasn't another forgotten tale waiting to be rediscovered. This was different. The first few pages read like any other Miss Marple mystery. A quiet village, a puzzling disappearance, a cast of characters whose secrets lay just beneath the surface. But as it continued, the tone changed. The familiar voice of Agatha Christie's writing, sharp, measured, deliberate, began to shift. The words became disjointed. The descriptions lingered too long on things that should not have mattered. And then, without warning, the mystery itself unraveled into something else entirely. The characters spoke in hushed tones of things they should not have known. The village itself seemed to change from one chapter to the next, its layout shifting as if it were alive. The missing person, at first just another unfortunate victim, was suddenly described in ways that defied reason. The collector reread the passage, his eyes moving over the same words, again and again, searching for the logic behind them. She had been seen walking the streets long after she had vanished. Her silhouette appeared in windows of houses that had been empty for years. Her voice, soft, distant, was heard calling out in the dead of night. But the most disturbing detail? No one could remember her face. The words on the page blurred as the collector blinked, his pulse quickening. The further he read, the less it felt like a story. The dialogue no longer seemed written, but transcribed, recorded, as if it had truly happened. And the deeper he went, the more he understood why this manuscript had never been published, why it had been buried. Because this was not fiction. It was something else. Then, near the final pages, he found it. A single note, scrawled in handwriting that did not match the rest of the manuscript. A warning, left behind by hands unknown. Miss Marple knew, but she could never tell. There are places in this world that do not belong. Places that do not show up on maps, that are not recorded in history, that exist only in whispers and half-remembered stories. Places that, when spoken of, cause those who know to glance over their shoulders, to change the subject, to pretend they never heard the name at all. One such place was written about in the manuscript. A village lost to time, removed from memory. A village with no roads leading to it, no signs marking its presence. And yet, somehow, it had visitors. People arrived, but they never left. Miss Marple had been summoned. An anonymous letter, no return address, no signature, only a handful of words, hurriedly scribbled on parchment that smelled of damp earth, and something else, something that made the paper feel wrong beneath the fingertips. People are vanishing. The church bell rings at midnight. Come at once. That was all it said. No plea for justice, no details of a crime, just a command, urgent and absolute. Miss Marple, ever the investigator, could not ignore it. She boarded a train the next day, but as she neared the station where she was to disembark, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, the world had changed. The rolling fields were gone. The trees were taller, their branches gnarled and twisted, reaching unnaturally toward the sky. The sky itself looked wrong. The clouds hung low, unmoving, as though they had been painted there and left to dry. When she stepped onto the platform, there was no one there to greet her. No conductor, no passengers, no station master. Only the silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in from all sides. A single dirt path led away from the station, disappearing into the thick fog that had settled over the land. There were no signs, no markers, only the path. And so, with nothing but her small suitcase in hand, Miss Marple followed it. She walked for what felt like hours, though her pocket watch insisted otherwise. The village came into view not gradually, but all at once, like a curtain had been drawn back to reveal a stage that had been waiting for its audience. Small cottages lined the narrow streets, their windows dark, their doors shut tight. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, but there was no movement inside, no figures at the windows, no sound of children playing, of merchants calling out their wares of life. The letter had given her no name, but she knew, in the deepest part of her mind, that this was where she had been called to. And yet something was wrong. The houses, they were too clean, too well kept for a place that felt so empty, as if they were being maintained, not lived in, as if something, was keeping them exactly as they should be, as they had always been. She approached the first cottage and knocked. The sound echoed unnaturally, stretching beyond the wooden door, beyond the walls, beyond the air itself. A long silence. Then, the sound of movement inside. Slow, measured. A man opened it. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, rimmed with dark circles, as though he had not slept in weeks. He did not greet her. He did not ask her business. He only looked at her, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't have come." Before she could respond, the door shut. The lock clicked into place, and from behind the closed door, she heard the scrape of furniture being dragged, as if he were barricading himself inside. She turned away from the house, her eyes scanning the empty streets. In the distance, a church tower loomed above the village, its bell tower stark against the motionless sky. And then, from behind her, a voice, soft, distant, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. They disappear overnight, and when they're gone, only their shadows remain. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The church. She had to go to the church. As she neared the building, the sensation of being watched grew heavier. There were no people, no figures in the windows, and yet she felt them, felt their eyes pressing against her from places she could not see. The doors of the church were open, swinging slightly as though they had been left ajar in haste. Inside, rows of pews stretched forward, their wooden frames untouched by dust. The altar stood at the front, and above it, the great bell loomed high in the tower. And then as she heard it, "If you hear the bell, it's already too late." She turned. The church was empty, completely, utterly empty. And yet in the pews, something had changed. The shadows, they were wrong. Too long, too still, stretching toward her, despite the absence of light. And then she saw her, a woman, standing at the far end of the church, dressed in mourning black, her hands clasped in front of her, her face obscured beneath a heavy veil, unmoving, watching. Miss Marple took a step forward, and the woman's eyes disappeared. Records do not lie. They are permanent, etched in ink and time, proof that what we remember is real. A town's history is built upon them, births, marriages, deaths, tragedies. But what if a town had no history at all? What if every document, every ledger, every newspaper ever printed said the same thing? That nothing had ever happened. Miss Marple had been to many villages in her time. Some were quiet, some were violent, some were shrouded in gossip and secrecy. But this one was different. The streets were too still, the houses too untouched. And when she visited the town clerk's office, looking for records of those who had lived there, she found something she had never encountered before. Nothing. There were no reports of thefts, no accidents, no missing persons, no crime, not a single unnatural death. It was as if tragedy had never touched this place, as if no one had ever died here. And yet the cemetery told a different story. Row upon row of gravestones stretched before her, each one freshly carved, each name perfectly legible despite their supposed age. There was no erosion, no moss creeping over the names, no signs of time wearing them down, as if the ground had never settled over the dead. But the most unsettling part, every headstone had the same inscription beneath the name and date. "We do not remember." She traced her fingers over the letters, feeling the depth of the engraving. It was recent, too recent. These graves, they were not old. They were new. But how could that be? As she stepped away, something caught her eye. A movement between the headstones. Slow, measured. She turned, expecting to see a mourner, a caretaker, someone. There was no one there. She left the cemetery that afternoon, but the feeling never left her. The air was wrong. The town was wrong. And every step she took carried the weight of something she could not name. She needed answers, and there was only one place left to look. The building sat at the edge of town, hidden beyond the trees. It was supposed to be abandoned. The windows were shattered, the doors chained shut, but the moment she stepped inside, she knew she was not alone. Inside, the air was thick with dust, undisturbed for years. The remnants of a time long past still clung to the walls, rotting patient files, rusted medical instruments, beds lined up in neat, decaying rows. And yet, something had been left behind. A single drawer, slightly ajar, as if someone had searched it not long ago. Inside, a collection of newspaper clippings, yellowed delicate, headlines that dated back to 1895, reports of patients who had lived here. But something was wrong. The names were there. The events were described in detail. But the photos, they were missing. No faces, no bodies, only empty spaces where people should have been. She flipped through the pages faster, searching for anything, something. And then her own name appeared. Her name, in an article written nearly a century before she was born. She was being watched. She turned sharply. A figure stood in the doorway, small, motionless, a child. "You don't belong here." The child's face twisted, the features melting away, reforming into something else. Something wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes too black. A smile, too many teeth, too much space between them. And then it was gone. She stumbled back, the room now empty, the papers scattered across the floor. But one remained, fluttering in the stale air, settling before her feet. A single sentence scrawled across it, in handwriting she did not recognize. The dead do not leave. We just forget them. She had to get out. She turned, running through the halls, past the empty chairs, past the gurneys covered in sheets that were too smooth, as if something was lying beneath them. Through the doors, through the overgrown path back toward the town, toward safety. But when she stepped outside, the sky was wrong. It was midday, but the sky had turned black. Some mysteries are meant to be solved. Others are meant to be forgotten. Agatha Christie was no stranger to the unknown. She spent her life weaving tales of deception, of crime, of puzzles waiting to be unraveled. But in 1926, for 11 days, she became a mystery herself. No one could explain it. One moment, she was there at home, with her husband, living the life of a literary genius. The next, she had vanished without a trace. The newspapers speculated, the police searched, the world waited for answers. And then she reappeared. No explanation, no recollection, only silence. She was found at a hotel, under a name that wasn't hers. And when they asked her where she had been, she simply smiled. A tired, knowing smile. And she said nothing. For nearly a century, people have asked the same question. Where did she go? What happened in those 11 days? And why did she never speak of it again? But the lost manuscript tells another story. A different story. A story she never meant for anyone to read. Miss Marple's case had been simple at first. A missing person. A village that shouldn't exist. A bell that rang when no one was inside the church. But as she read deeper into the pages, the lines between fact and fiction began to blur. The case changed. The names changed. The people changed. And then the story changed her. It was a book that did not obey the rules of literature. A book that wrote itself even as she turned the pages. A book that did not end. She flipped to the next chapter, expecting the continuation of the mystery. Instead, she found something else. The chapter was not about the case. It was about her. About Miss Marple. About where she had been, where she had walked, what she had seen. And then she read the words that made her blood run cold. She is reading this now. She turned the page, her hands trembling. And there, written in handwriting that was not her own, was a passage she did not remember writing. A passage describing what she was doing at that exact moment. Sitting in a chair, the book in her lap, the candle beside her flickering. And then, the last line. She looks up and sees someone standing in the doorway. Her eyes snapped up. The room was empty, or at least it should have been. She turned another page, faster now, desperate. The ink on the next line was fresh, wet, as if it had just been written. She is not supposed to know. Sound. The typewriter begins clicking again, furious, unrelenting. Words being typed too fast for human hands. She slammed the book shut, her breath coming quick, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. The manuscript had changed. It was no longer a record of an old case. It was a warning. But who had written it? A pause. Then a whisper, so faint, so distant, barely more than a breath. She remembers now. She looked down. The manuscript was burning. The edges blackened, the words dissolving before her eyes. But she did not let go. She should have. Every instinct told her to drop it, to let it turn to ash, to leave whatever this was behind. But she held on. And then, as the last page curled and darkened, she whispered, so quietly that even she wasn't sure she had spoken at all. I remember now. A moment stretched, held, as if time itself had paused to listen. The door stood open, swinging slightly, the darkness beyond it alive in its stillness. There was nothing outside. No trees, no ground, no stars in the sky, only an absence, a void that should not have been. And yet, something was there, just beyond the threshold, not stepping forward, not moving at all, just waiting, The shadows inside the room continued to shift, writhing, curling along the floor, stretching along the walls in places they had no right to be. And the voice, so close now, whispering against the inside of her skull. She does not belong here. But the words weren't spoken in warning. They weren't a plea for her to leave. No, they were something else. Something final. Something that carried the weight of knowledge she did not want. Miss Marple was not the kind of woman who was easily unsettled. She had stared into the eyes of killers, had walked alone into houses where blood still stained the walls. But this was different. This was not fear. Fear was rational. Fear was a reaction to danger. This was something deeper, something ancient, a feeling that reached down into the marrow of her bones and whispered the truth she had not yet dared to say aloud. She was not meant to leave this place. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from something else. Her body knew something her mind had not yet accepted, that she had been here before, that this was not the first time she had walked this path, not the first time she had sat in this chair, staring into the empty night. She turned slowly. The embers of the burned manuscript smoldered on the table, glowing faintly like dying stars. And then they flickered. And in that brief flash, she saw it. The chair by the fireplace was not empty anymore. She did not turn to face it. She did not need to. She could feel it now, the weight of its presence, pressing against her skin like the pressure of deep water. It had been here all along, watching, waiting. You remember now, don't you? She could feel it smiling. Her breath was shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears. And yet, she did not move. She did not speak. She only listened, because some things should not be acknowledged. Some things should not be seen. But the voice, her own voice, had already spoken. The words had already been said. I remember now. And now so did it. She closed her eyes. There was no logic left in this. No reasoning. No deductions to be made. This was not a puzzle to be solved. This was something older. Something far beyond her understanding. And yet she knew, deep in the places where memory and instinct tangled together, that there was still one thing left to do. She turned the page. The manuscript should have been gone. It had burned, its ashes scattered across the table. And yet, here it was, whole once more, its pages pristine, its words untouched by flame. But now it had changed. There was no title, no opening paragraph, only a single line, written in ink that was still wet. She is sitting in a chair. The door is open. She is reading these words now. Her fingers curled against the armrest. Her gaze locked on the page as the ink bled, shifting, reshaping itself into new words. Words that should not be forming on their own. She does not want to turn around, but she will. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to stay still, to fight against the pull of the words. But they kept coming, forming faster now, spilling across the page in frantic, slashing strokes. She will look over her shoulder now. She squeezed her eyes shut. She would not. She would not. And then the final line appeared. It is smiling. Her body was frozen, her mind teetering between rationality and something far worse. And then, before she could stop herself, before she could think, she turned her head. There is a moment, just before terror takes hold, where the mind hesitates, where logic clings to the last frayed edge of reason, fighting to make sense of the impossible. But reason had abandoned this place long ago, and now so had time. Miss Marple turned her head. The space behind her, where nothing should have been, was no longer empty. She did not scream. She did not move. She only stared, because the thing looking back at her had her face. It sat in the chair she had seen before. Same posture, same folded hands, the firelight casting long shadows over the edges of its too pale skin. But the eyes were wrong. They were not eyes at all. The book was still in her lap, pages flipping on their own, the ink shifting, crawling across the parchment as if alive. And then the words stopped moving. They settled into place, forming a single sentence at the bottom of the page. She is already here. She blinked, and the figure in the chair was gone. The door to the cottage was still open. The darkness beyond it vast and waiting. The embers on the table had gone cold. The candle beside her had melted down to nothing. How long had she been sitting here? The book was still in her lap. She wanted to throw it away, to burn it again, to rid herself of whatever this was. But she couldn't, because deep down she knew this wasn't over. She turned another page. The next words were waiting for her. She will stand now. She will walk to the mirror. She will see the truth. The mirror sat against the far wall, framed in wood as old as the house itself. She did not want to look, but the words on the page had already told her what would happen. She reached it. The glass was smudged, dust collecting along its edges. And there, standing just behind her shoulder, it was waiting. Her reflection was not her own. It looked like her, but it was not her. The face was too smooth, the expression too empty. And then, it smiled. The reflection raised a hand. But Miss Marple did not. It moved when she did not move. It blinked when she did not blink. And then, slowly, it reached forward toward the surface of the glass. She stepped back. The mirror trembled. The cracks spread outward, jagged and uneven, splitting down the center of her face. And then the words in the book changed again. She will hear the voice now. You should not have remembered. She turned back to the book. The final page had written itself. The ink was fresh, the letters carved deep into the paper. She will know the ending now. She was never meant to leave. The air had changed. Heavier now. Still, but not empty. It pressed against the walls, against the wooden beams of the cottage, against the edges of her mind. The book lay open in her lap. The words unmoving, settled into the page as though they had always been there. She should not have remembered. She was never meant to leave. But now she knew. The mirror still stood in front of her. The cracks had spread, splintering outward like veins of something long dead. But she did not dare look into it again. Her reflection had already shown her enough. She forced herself to move, to step away, to put distance between herself and the thing that had been watching her from the other side of the glass. But the words on the page held her in place. She could not leave. Not yet. Because the story was not finished. She did not want to read the next words, but they had already been written. She will hear them now. A whisper, low, murmured words, just beyond the range of understanding. The sound of voices layered over one another, overlapping, weaving together like threads in a tapestry too tangled to unravel. They were speaking, but not to her. About her. She was not alone. And she never had been. She turned the next page. The ink had thickened, as though freshly applied, the edges of the words slightly smeared. She was not the first. She will not be the last. The voices grew clearer, slow, intentional. She should not have remembered. But she did. She stood. The book closed in her hands. She needed to leave. Now, she moved toward the door, but the house had changed. The walls were not where they had been. The windows were gone. The fireplace stood where the door should have been, the light from the embers casting shadows against nothing at all. She turned back to where she had been sitting, and the chair, it was still occupied. She did not see it move. She did not see it stand. But now it was standing, and it was waiting. And then it smiled, almost amused. It is time to go. There are doors that lead somewhere, and then there are doors that lead nowhere. Miss Marple stood before it, the door that had not been there before, the door that should not exist. It was old, too old, the wood warped, the brass handle dulled by time, and yet she knew it had never been used. Or rather, it had never been used by anyone who had returned. The wind had died. The candle on the table did not flicker. The air was heavy, thick, pressing against her skin. Beyond the door, there was no sound, no hint of what lay beyond. And yet, something was waiting. A pause, a long-waited silence. She reached for the handle. Sound, the slow turn of brass, the quiet click of an unlocking mechanism that should not have existed. The door opened on its own. Behind it was nothing. Not darkness, Not light, not absence, but something far worse. The kind of emptiness that watched. Sound, a breath, long, slow, drawn from a place that was not in this world. She stepped forward. The air changed as soon as she crossed the threshold. The sensation of weight lifted, but it was not relief. It was something else, something wrong. The room was not unfamiliar. It was her sitting room, the same fireplace, the same bookshelves, the same teacup on the table, filled to the brim, and yet she had just left that place behind. She turned back to the door, but it was gone. There was no entrance, no exit, no walls behind her at all, just the room, existing on its own. And then she saw it. The chair, the same chair she had left behind, and in it, she was sitting there, her own reflection, her own face, staring back at her, but not moving, not breathing, a version of herself frozen in time. And then it blinked. Her lips did not move, but her voice filled the room. "You are too late." She turned her head. The book was on the table, the same book, the one that had burned, the one that should not exist. It was open to a page she had not written. She is standing in front of herself. She will understand now. Her throat was dry, her pulse steady but wrong. She looked back at the chair, at the woman herself, watching her with unblinking eyes. And then the reflection smiled. The book had not been finished. The last chapter had been left unwritten, and now the ink was still wet. She stepped forward. The version of herself in the chair did not move, but the words in the book did. She will take the pen now. She did not want to, but her hand moved anyway, as if she had done this before. The reflection watched her, waiting, expectant. The book waited too. What happens if I don't? Then the story begins again. The room shifted, the walls stretched, the shadows lengthened, the fire cracked apart, revealing only more darkness beneath it. She had no choice. She had already made it. She picked up the pen, and she wrote the final line. The book closed itself. The chair was empty. The reflection was gone. She was alone, or perhaps she always had been. The village was still there, outside the window. The church bell had stopped ringing. The streets were quiet again. It was over. Or was it? She turned, looking for something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But all that remained was the book. And the words on its cover. Not Miss Marple's last case. Not the forgotten story. But something else. Her name. She was never meant to leave. Years later, a different time, a different place. A collector walks through the aisles of an old bookshop, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. His fingers brush along the spines of forgotten stories, tracing dust-covered titles, until one catches his eye. An old manuscript, bound in leather, untitled. He pulls it free, opens to the first page, and there, in neat, inked handwriting, a single line waits for him. She was never supposed to leave. She remembers now. 4 decades, Agatha Christie's disappearance in 1926 remained an enigma. But what if it was never truly solved? What if Miss Marple's final case was never meant to be found? Was she uncovering secrets, or was she part of something far greater, something beyond fiction? Now, I turn the question to you. Do you believe Agatha Christie stumbled upon something she was never supposed to know? Could Miss Marple have been hiding a truth far darker than any of us imagined? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more mysteries that push the limits of reality, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that were never meant to be told.